So this is part 8 of my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Statesman, a Platonic dialogue. So we've been discussing a new method by which we can boil down the statesman and the sophist. We have gone on a few different tributaries, determining certain things, relieving others from our journey. All of these things would be a bit much, I think, to recap here. And so I think it's appropriate that if curiosity finds its way into the mind, that the previous episodes will suffice to fill in those gaps. But now we continue to divide things, to separate them into two, and narrow them down into principles or ideas that lead us to the identity of what we are after. So in this case, it's the king and the statesman. And the method by which we are doing this is to separate out the thing of attention from those that surround it. And we are using an analogy to get there, something that is similar to a particular type of caring. And of course, this particular type of caring, as it relates to kingmanship and statesmanship, is that of the herding of human beings. So like always, the general progression that I've been using to reflect on this dialogue has been to read 2 pages and then to go back and to pick out the details and try to make sense of them. So this dialogue is between the visitor and young Socrates. The Socrates that we are familiar with is sort of standing in the background. Young Socrates is his namesake, having the same name but not of the same person. So the visitor says, "As for what comes next, let's reflect that someone might perhaps suppose that weaving had been adequately described when put like this, being unable to grasp that it had not yet been divided off from those operative arts that border on it, while it had been parceled off from many other related ones." Young Socrates says, "Tell me, which related ones?" You didn't follow what's been said, it seems. So it looks as if we have to go back again, starting from the end. If you grasp the kinship, in this case, we cut off one related expertise from weaving just now, separating it off the putting together of blankets by means of distinction between putting round and putting under. I understand. What's more, we took away all craftwork out of flax, esparto, and what we just now by analogy called sinews of plants. Again, we divided off both the art of felting and the sort of putting together that uses perforation and sewing, of which the largest is the art of cobbling. Absolutely. Still further, working with skins, which looks after coverings cut in a small piece, and those sorts of activities that look after shelters, all those involved in building and carpentry in general, and other sorts of expertise, contriving shelter from inflowing water. All of these we took away. Also, all those sorts of expertise in forms of protection that offer preventative products in relation to thefts and violent acts, and those that have to do with carrying out the work of lid making and fixings to doorways, which are assigned as parts of the art of joinery. And we cut away the art of arms manufacture, a segment of the great and varied capacity which is defense production. Then again, our first and immediate move was to divide off the whole of the art of magic, which is concerned with protective charms, and we have left behind, as we might suppose, the very expertise we looked for, which protects us against cold weather, productive of woolen defense, and called by the same name of weaving. Yes, that seems to be so. But put like this, my boy, it is not yet complete. The person who puts his hand first to the production of clothes seems to do the opposite of weaving. How so? The business of weaving, I suppose, is a sort of intertwining. Yes. But in fact, what I'm talking about is a matter of breaking apart things that are combined or matted together. What is it you're referring to? The function of the art of the carder, or shall we dare call the art of carding the art of weaving, and treat the carder as if he were a weaver? Certainly not. And then, too, if someone calls the art of manufacturing warp and woof weaving, he is using a name that is not only odd, but false. Quite. And what about these cases? Are we to put down the whole of the art of fulling and clothes mending as being no sort of care for clothes, nor as any sort of looking after them? Or shall we refer to all of those, too, as arts of weaving? Certainly not. Yet all of these will dispute the role of looking after the producing clothes with the capacity which is the art of weaving, conceding a very large part to it, but assigning large shares to themselves too. Certainly. Then again, in addition to these, we must suppose that the sorts of expertise responsible for making the tools through which the products of weaving are completed will also lay claim to being at least a contributory cause of every woven article. Quite correct. So will our account of that part of the art of weaving that we selected be sufficiently definite if we proceed to set it down as finest and greatest of all those sorts of care that exist in relation to woolen clothing? Or would we be saying something true, but not clear or complete until such time as we remove all of these too from around it? Correct. Then after this we must do what we are saying we should do, in order that our account may proceed in due order. Quite. Well then, let's look at two sorts of expertise that are in relation to all the things that people do. Which are they? One which is contributory, cause of production, one which is itself a cause. How so? Says young Socrates. So this completes our 2 pages. So now I'd like to go back into this and pick some of this apart. The first thing that I want to mention is that through the analogy, we have to think about 2 things. We have to think about the literal aspect of what he is speaking about. So the various expertises that he is considering. The art of weaving is our primary focus. He had a bit of dialogue earlier, that being he being the visitor, in which he quickly went through the divisions. And I should mention that these divisions did not involve particular classes of expertise. It was more general, and it could be widened out into that philosophical territory. And it offered some interesting reflection on the last episode for exactly what it could mean to have a particular definition or division. So I'll read the first sentence here, just so we can get a general sense of what that previous dialogue was like. The visitor says, "Well then, all the things we make and acquire are either for the sake of our doing something or they prevent something's happening to us. Of preventives, some are charms, whether divine or human, warding things off, others forms of defense." And he sort of keeps on going from there until he gets down to weaving. So the first thing he says after this, as for what comes next, let's reflect that someone might perhaps suppose that weaving had been adequately described when put like this, being unable to grasp that it had not yet been divided off from those cooperative arts that border on it, while it had been parceled off from many other related ones. So again, keeping in mind that we have to think about the literal thing that's being said, about the literal expertise, and more the philosophical analogizing that we're doing. The philosophical bit is going to be where our production and our reflection probably rests. We're going to use the literal aspect as a springboard onto it. Now, eventually, we're going to get into something that approaches our primary object, which is the Statesman, but this is going to, I think, this tributary is going to take some time. So I think what he is getting at here is that through his divisions, although they were not explicitly mentioning specific expertise by which we separated off, it can be implied, it can be reasoned, it can be reflected or imagined that close associations to broad topics of division, and again I'll go back because this is our primary division source. He says of preventives. Now preventives is an important division. Some are charms, whether divine or human, warding things off. Others forms of defense. Of forms of defense, some are ways of arming for war. Others forms of protection. Of forms of protection, some are screens. Others are means of warding off cold and hot weather. Of the latter type of protectives, some are shelters, others are coverings. Of coverings, one sort consists of things spread under, a different sort of things put round. Of the things put round, some are cut in one piece, while a different sort are compound. Of the compound, some are perforated, others are bound together without perforation. Of the unperforated, some are made of sinews, of things growing from the earth, others of hair. Of those made of hair, some are stuck together by means of water and earth, others are bound together with themselves. So, this gives an idea of his divisions, but really nowhere in there do we have the specific forms of expertise. So he's saying now, let's suppose that weaving had been accurately described when we put it this way. And before he had mentioned that, at least when we reach the art of clothes making, that he says there's only a nominal difference between the art of clothes making and weaving, because weaving is the functional part of clothes making. And so by that, they are synonymous, for our purposes at least. Now the thing he says is, and shall we say that weaving too, insofar as it represented the largest part of manufacture of clothes, does not differ at all, except in name, from this art of clothes making, just as in that other case we said that the art of kingship did not differ from that of statesmanship. Now, there's sort of a tongue-in-cheek here, because of course there's a difference between kingship and statesmanship. That's our object. But there's a similarity on one level of view. And so I think that the question that he's posing here, suppose that weaving had been adequately described when put like this. I think in one sense, what they would miss is not necessarily a technical, but a strong definition once we reach down into these principles that are approaching the identity of the thing itself. That when we can go no farther, when we're at the sort of first principles of our design, of our object, and when we can go no farther, then we can say perhaps that we have arrived at a place of naming and identification. But it seems we are not quite there. He continues. So he says, let's reflect that someone might perhaps suppose that weaving had been adequately described when put like this, being unable to grasp that it had not yet been divided off from those cooperative arts that border on it, while it had been parceled off from many other related ones. So there's another sense in which, maybe despite weaving not being appropriately described, we're assuming for a moment, that weaving had been appropriately described by our method of division. But if he had not seen, not understood, the ways in which we have secluded weaving from other related arts, then those objects, those characteristics that are similar to it, that again occupy those broad categories through which we went through the division, they would muddle our understanding of what the weaver is or what the weaver does, the identity of the weaver. So then young Socrates gives us an opportunity by saying, I don't really understand what you mean, to go through this again. And so now he's going to give us some specific examples. And despite this not being as philosophically perhaps dense, I think we can still make some of it when we see the specific expertise. We'll draw out of it, I think, what he is trying to point to here, why it's so important to understand why the separation of expertises from our primary object, or the conclusion that we've come to, that principle that is now approaching our analogy to the statesman and to the kingship, why it's so important to have things separated from it, to have it secluded, sequestered. So in response to young Socrates' confusion, the visitor continues and he says, if you grasp the kinship in this case, we cut off one related expertise from weaving just now, separating off the putting together of blankets by means of the distinction between putting round and putting under. Now, from the last episode, I had no idea that's what we were doing. And I'm not even sure when the visitor was going through this initially, or Plato was going through this, whatever the situation was. I sort of wonder what road he went through, because of course we didn't start with the weaver. What we started was with, on the top of this division tree, he says, all the things we make and acquire are either for the sake of our doing something. Now there were thoughts about weaving before. He says, why then don't we now do the very same thing with weaving that we did in what preceded, dividing each thing, cutting it into parts? So the idea of weaving is there, maybe the weaver is not there. But of course, the first separation, all the things we make and acquire are either for the sake of our doing, or they prevent something's happening to us. That in and of itself does not bring up the idea of the weaver in my mind. So when we got to the part of the division tree, in which we were speaking about the distinction between putting round and putting under, this took on much more of a philosophical tone. So the question now is, where do we go from here? Of course, we have to integrate this into the end of the division tree, into the weaver and the clothes maker, the art of clothes making. But we also have to stay consistent with where we were philosophically. So let's begin by giving a literal definition to putting round and putting under. And this has to do with specific types of manufacture. So in terms of putting round, we have wrapping fibers or strands around one another. This produces things like felts, mats, or layered blankets, where the material is pressed or circled together without passing through. Now putting under, this is weaving proper, in which one thread is passed over or under another. This produces an interlaced structures of cloth in which warp and weft alternates. So the blanket example belongs to the putting round method. Layers are pressed together like quilt batting, not woven. So in terms of weaving, we're after the type of putting under. Now here I should mention, what we're after is a particular essence. And while I said earlier, it may not have been the case that explicitly the visitor was after the expertise of or thinking about the weaver. But we've been focusing on a few different terms that are fundamental, that we have to get down right. And the method by which we get there is a bit tedious, but important nonetheless. And one of these terms is care. One of the terms is herding. One of the terms is weaving, as we are getting into now. The other thing that he had mentioned not too long ago, after the exposition on the myth of Cronus, was the introduction of a model. And this model is something that we were not exposed to in the Sophist. In the Sophist, we had a long discussion about between that which is and that which is not, and the marriage between them. And I've symbolized that which is and that which is not in the form of a chess piece, two chess pieces. One is the king, that which is not is the queen. And they each have their principled actions in the world. It is by their marriage, rather than the presence of one alone, that allows all that is to be. It allows various identities to be without collapsing into something that is but is inert. And then also it prevents against collapsing into that which is not, which is pure nothingness and meaninglessness. And so, again, the marriage between these two is fundamental. And this gets into all sorts of things like truth and falsehood, what we were talking about now in terms of the relationship among identities and differentiating kinds from each other. And we established that that which is, and identity in general, exists only by its relation to other things. If there was no relation to other things, then it would be sort of this vacuous thing of that which is. And if that was the case, then there would be no difference. There would be nothing of that which is not, and again, thingness would be inert. The productive potential and capacity would be nil. The model comes into play when we are thinking about the in-between, when we are thinking about the connection between the two. And I think what this dialectic method is doing well is to bring us down to a point where we have a model by which this sort of essence of weaving provides us with almost, in essence, the essence of the statesman. Because if we can understand his function, we can understand his purpose and what he does. So the statesman, instead of just being this definition of a man who has a particular responsibility, but by his ignorance, by his arrogance, or by his wisdom, he may participate with this responsibility differently, and it may vary. But if we know sort of at the core of this broad effect spectrum of how he operates, then it's much easier to identify the good in the way that he must operate. So the visitor says, "What's more, we took away all craft work out of flax, esparto, and what we just now by analogy called sinews of plants. Again, we divided off both the art of felting and the sort of putting together that uses perforation and sewing, of which the largest is the art of cobbling." So I can't remember, today is a new day. I can't remember if the other day I went through this superficially. I know I didn't go through it in any particular detail, but I like to do that now, and then explain perhaps a rough philosophical equivalent. So he's explaining things that have been separated from. So if weaving is going to be one of these things that approach us quite closely to kingship and statesmanship by virtue of its interwoven nature, then it's going to be important to understand how all of these are different from. So starting with flax. Flax is a plant whose fibers, linen, are spun and woven into cloth. In antiquity, flax was a symbol of the more delicate, thread-based textile arts. So immediately, I think it's not necessarily clear how flax is different from weaving. There's a subtle difference. We have to remember that flax fibers are long, fine, and can be spun into linen thread. Flax itself is the material that is used in the process of weaving. It is not weaving itself. Now there's a process by which one produces flax. But if we're looking for the statesman, we are not looking for the process that created human beings that are woven together to create a culture or a society, a civilization. That's a separate issue. The statesman is not concerned with that type of creation. It's outside of his power to do so. What is within his power to do is to weave, is to facilitate. So the next thing that he mentions is esparto. Now esparto is a coarse Mediterranean grass, stiff and strong, used for mats, sandals, baskets, ropes. Unlike flax, it is not spun into fine threads, but used in its natural toughness. So again, we have another example, much like flax, of how esparto is kind of close to what we're thinking about in terms of this weaving. It is used to create structures that are useful. But the primary philosophical association is the interwovenness. It is the diving under, such that we have this interconnected network of fibers. And with esparto, we don't have this. Esparto crafts rely on braiding, plaiting, or matting, not the delicate warp and weft of weaving. Now the next is sinews, or sinews, as I've been calling it, sinews of plants. Now a sinew of a plant, it is a cord, fiber, and strand, like the sinews of a body, like a tendon. Now these strands of the plants give us the material to bind and to weave with. Examples would be hemp, papyrus, or rushes. Now again, we have a similar sort of explanation here. It is a precursor to that process by which we are concerned with, weaving, so we necessarily have to separate out those arts from what we are after. Now felting, unlike weaving, the warp and weft, felting binds fibers together by compression, moisture, and pressure. It's a mass technique, not an interlacing one. And so if we were to think about a ruler under this capacity that had expertise in this type of art, this sort of associated art, I think perhaps of a tyrant, a despot, one who wishes to control by that pressure rather than the interlocking facilitatory experience. He says again, we divided off both the art of felting and the sort of putting together that uses perforation and sewing, of which the largest is the art of cobbling. So perforation and sewing, another distinct joining method, piercing holes and binding with thread. So he mentions the largest craft being cobbling, which is shoemaking, since shoes are stitched together out of leather. So it's a type of binding, it's a type of unification, but again, the procedure is different. It is not as delicate, it's not as intricate. Now young Socrates responds, absolutely. So for the next, the visitor says, still further, working with skins, which looks after coverings cut in a single piece, and those sorts of activities that look after shelter, all those involved in building and carpentry in general, and in other sorts of expertise, contriving shelter from inflowing water, all of these we took away. So I sort of want to ask why now of these. So of a single piece, he mentions skins. We don't necessarily have to go into a historical context here. It's self-explanatory for the most part. So the coverings that are of a single piece. So if we imagine a king or a statesman that only had authority or scope, vision over a piece of that society or of that civilization, what would it mean? And I suppose that question is difficult to answer now because we haven't come to some strong definition of the king or the statesman. But through this process, I think we can come up with something. So what shall we say? Well, we're faced with the question, is it better to have dominion, influence, authority over part or over the whole? And the qualifier would be, well, it depends on what the authority is used for. If we take sort of the optimistic view of the ruler, of the statesman or of the king, and we say that this person is in power or in authority to help manage something of the collective, something that would not be managed if left to the collective alone, because it must be delegated. Now, the person who's responsible for that can be elected among the group, surely. But nonetheless, there has to be somebody or a group of people that are responsible for it. So whether we say it's of the king or of the statesman, each of these are going to have some institutional apparatus that supports them. Neither of them operates in isolation. So of themselves they are a part, but they themselves, being the part, are not responsible for only governing a part. Because if this was the case, then their influence would only be partial. And, in the good sense, in the good context, if their governing is to facilitate, if it is to strengthen that harmonious order that we spoke of in the Age of Cronus earlier, then what we would want is for the civic institution to be widespread. So keeping in mind, we are talking about a protective, but we're not talking about the class of protectives that involve shelter. So I think this is another key aspect in how we might add to our definition of what the statesman is. Insofar as the statesman is not, it is not necessary for the statesman to provide for its citizens with shelter. The responsibility may be there for some other apparatus, but it is not for that civil authority, nor is it for the king. All those involved in building and carpentry in general. So building and carpentry, it's a particular type of expertise. Familiar images of what we just spoke of building things, of having this sort of protective shelter does come to mind. But there are plenty of things that can be built. There are plenty of things that, through building and through carpentry, the creative aspects of the human mind can flourish. In such an individual pursuit seems not of the nature that is attributed to the broad-scale interweaving that we are after. Now, that's not to say that it is not involved in the interweaving, because obviously it is. Those carpenters and builders are the fibers that are interwoven in the society. But it is the way in which they are woven that is important. In other sorts of expertise, contriving shelter from inflowing water. So water being a symbol for chaos, a force of destruction potentially. Now this preventive against the force of destruction, or perhaps we can say of nature, I think about a particular clause in the Magna Carta, which has to do, or had to do, with the fortification of banks. And the curtailment in the 13th century was that the barons wished to reduce the bounds of fortification of these embankments. And I have to imagine that there was some unfortunate consequence that resulted from this, such that perhaps people's homes were flooded downstream of the river of the embankment that was fortified, or flooding of agricultural land, whatever it happened to be. So that's the first thing I think about when I think about the civic authority putting its foot into something of that nature. But in a broader sense, I think about the collective, the collective's relationship to the governing authority, and how, if the governing authority is to establish something akin to a shelter at that level, whatever the appropriate spiritual metaphor would be, or analogy, or a political institution, and by extension, the material enterprise that comes about because of that. Or we consider the potential states for confusion or chaos that water might bring, the potential for destruction. And I think as of a preventive, this is surely something that's possible. And I have to wonder, we all have opinions about things. We all come to understand our political beliefs through different lenses. Not that there cannot be a solid definition of things, but by the same token, I can see the visitor is moving to something. And the way in which he's moving to it, I have to ask myself the question, how much of this reality are we finding versus how much are we producing? And by this I mean, man is surely capable of the creative energy. If he is to be made in the image of God, then he has this capacity for creation and production and development. But also, I think what we see, what we can identify in regards to patterns in nature, there are different ways in which things are governed. There are different ways in which nature relates itself within itself. And I know I'm being a bit vague, but insofar as we're talking about a broad-scale pattern for which the society, the civilization, is a network of individuals that are all interacting with one another, such that some stable and productive order is the end result. The reflection is that the visitor, I think, truly cares about the proper orientation of the statesman and the king. But also I have to wonder about his division and about what he precludes. I don't want to say too much based on this, because I think that there are ways that we can find ourselves in situations that I don't expect. But I'm curious. I'm very curious about how the view of this society and how the proper orientation of the statesman is meant to be seen. How universal this is. The visitor says, all of these we took away. Also, all of those sorts of expertise and forms of protection that offer preventative products in relation to thefts and violent acts, and those that have to do with carrying out the work of lid making and fixing doorways, which are assigned as parts of the art of joinery. So here's another part in which we know for certain that as we are breaking this down, there are philosophical off-roads. I find it difficult to say philosophical equivalents, but philosophical off-roads, in the sense that when we are speaking about these various forms of expertise in the way that we are, the model is meant to show on a smaller scale or a practical scale the reflection of the expertise of statesmanship. And by this, along each rung within this interwoven or connected illustration, analogy, whatever word we want to use, model, there has to be an explanation. Now, the explanation may not be correct, I suppose, but the explanation is philosophical nonetheless. One of our contemporary understandings of government is that it is responsible for protecting its citizens, upholding the rule of law, a standard of law. Now, at this point, I'm not sure if it's appropriate to say that what we are excluding is the statesman's role in well, here I hesitate because I think I've made an error. The error was too closely associating the expertise of the statesman with the expertise of another, but for which the expertise of the other may be utilized by the statesman to uphold his knowledge of weaving, let's say. So while it's easy to be seen how related expertise can almost be inseparable, like for example, the production of the very thing that we use in the expertise of weaving. We can have things that are adjacent and quite closely related, like the enforcement of law or of policing, and yet this not necessarily be the sole or the responsibility of the statesman. It is sort of an extension. But by the same token, the mind and the primary focus of his ontology, let's say, maybe that's a bit much, but well, maybe I'll leave it there, his ontology, is the weaving, is the interconnected nature of things. Eventually his mind will come across maintaining law and order, protection, and all of this sort of thing. But it is for a broader purpose. Now he says, the forms of protection, preventative products in relation to thefts and violent acts, and those that have to do with carrying out the work of lid making, something that covers something else, either to keep in or to keep out. Now the state is surely responsible for keeping something in and preventing from something else getting in, like the foreigner, which is potentially dangerous, may potentially carry a pathogen. And the danger is obvious in these cases. I think that there are plenty of ways in which we can expand out the image of the lid maker and what the consequences of a poorly placed lid or a strongly placed lid are. And the same, I think, applies with doors. Doors are barriers. They're dividers. The division itself really may not have anything to do with protection, but they also have that capacity. The art of joinery would be something even more fundamental. Of joinery, I think about an axis. When something moves around an axis, I think about something fundamental, a principle, something that holds the purpose of something, essentially. If the door is to be functional, then it must rotate around an axis. If it doesn't have a strong, stable axis, it cannot perform its function. So it is the precursor of this performing of a function. And the function is specifically division, but also protection. So maybe we can see a statesman directing a joinery, or a maker of of the art of joinery, He says, and we cut away the art of the arms manufacture, a sergeant of that great and varied capacity, which is defense production. Of course, this would be an arm of the state. We could say that the executive of our executive branch is in charge of the military, but there are other people that are responsible for the manufacture of arms, of military equipment. Then again, our first and immediate move was to divide off the whole of the art of magic, which is concerned with protective charms. And we have left behind, as we might suppose, the very expertise we looked for, which protects us against cold weather, productive of woolen defense, and called by the name of weaving. Okay, so what is he saying here? He mentions dividing off the whole of the art of magic, which is concerned with protective charms. And he says that we have left behind, perhaps as a result of this, the thing that we were looking for, which is weaving, but we didn't know it at the time, because we didn't just go from protective charms to weaving. Weaving was buried in this entirely other division tree. So if we went down the tree of the charms, we would have missed the weaving. Of course, we could have just walked our way back up the tree and then made a new path, but that would be a complaint of insufficiency, then, I would imagine, by the visitor. We've already had this experience. Either in the Sophist or the Statesman, I can't remember now. So here I think, just as a personal matter, it's important to stop and to reflect on how we might go about problem solving on a day-to-day basis, on a practical basis. Sometimes I wonder exactly how these sorts of experiences, like, reflecting on the Platonic dialogues, are going to be practical in my everyday life. And oftentimes I find that it is, sometimes in more subtle ways than I can imagine. Other times I wish that it was more involved in my decision making, especially when I make stupid mistakes. But as far as this reflection goes, the reflection on the part of the visitor, he's, I think, calling for, he's calling attention to care. He's calling attention to prudence, such that we have to be very careful not to discard things, that when we are narrowing things down to their smallest principles, that we have a very solid understanding. We have done some sort of precursory work to understand generally what path we should take, even though we don't necessarily understand what the end is. Now, in this case, we had an idea of weaving in mind, and an interwoven nature, network type nature, as it relates to kingship and statesmanship. So that helps us. And I suppose that if we didn't have a solid understanding of where we were potentially going, or would like to go, then we would get caught in that place of deception, because magic is not just a thing of superstition. It's a thing. It's an art of persuasion and deception, potentially, a sophistry. And so, if we divide it incorrectly with regard to the Statesman, much like confusing the art of magic, let's say, for a true type of weaving, because there's plenty of maybe a particular type of interweaving things to understand and ultimately to use it to deceive. After all, the sophist is a lover of knowledge. but it's not true. It's partial. The falsehood at some level breaks the entire thing. And what we are after, of course, is something that is true, something that is real, something that is sustainable. Now, by this, in light of this, he goes into a farther distinction. He goes into distinction, a certain type of clarity. Another thing that I think I've noticed in life, that I kick myself for not paying attention to the details. Sometimes I get lost in the lack of concern for them, because I believe that most of them are trivial, when in fact some of them are quite important and should not be discarded. So in this situation, he describes that this division is not yet complete. The person who puts his hand first to the production of clothes seems to do the opposite of weaving. Now, at first glance, this might sound like something that is nonsensical. How could this be? Of course they have to be involved in weaving if they're going to be in the production of clothes. He says the business of weaving, I suppose, is a sort of interweaving, or intertwining, rather. In fact, what I'm talking about is a matter of breaking apart things that are combined or matted together. So the business is matted on top of or combined with the actual act of this interweaving. He says the function of the art of the carder. This is the thing that he's referring to, carder being C-A-R-D-E-R. Or shall we dare to call the art of carding the art of weaving, and treat the carder as if he were a weaver. So what we need here is a bit of historical context, otherwise this carder is not going to make any sense. At least it doesn't to me. So carding is a stage in textile production. Before wool, flax, or other fibers can be spun into thread and then woven, they must be cleaned, disentangled, and aligned. This is done with tools called cards, flat paddles, and wire teeth. In antiquity, they might have used teasel plants, combs, or other rough brushes. The carder's job was to take raw fleece and comb it until the fibers all run in the same direction, removing knots and debris. This prepares it for spinning. So the carder doesn't weave, in other words. The visitor says, he says, and then too, if someone calls the art of manufacturing warp and woof weaving, he is using a name that is not only odd, but false. Okay, so some more context here. Warp and woof. In weaving, you need two sets of threads. The warp, the vertical threads, held taut on a loom. They're the stable backbone of fabric. The woof, or weft, the horizontal threads woven in and out across the warp. Together, warp plus woof interlace produced cloth. So the art of manufacturing the warp and woof is still not weaving. So we can see how closely we are getting now to the weaver. He says, and what about these cases? Are we to put down the whole of the art of fulling and clothes mending as being no sort of care for clothes, nor as any sort of looking after them? Or shall we refer to all of these too as arts of weaving? Okay, so perhaps it's important to pause here. What I'm interested in thinking about is, to what degree, to what level are we approaching the statesman as we appear to be approaching the weaver? We are so close to him. Something as fundamental to weaving as the warp and woof, that their manufacture is still not the thing that we have to be concerned with. I think this highlights, in part, how easy it is for the name of something to be perverted, or the role of something to be subverted. For the statesman, if he is to be a weaver, the warp and woof to him is difficult to say. What would we call it? The law, the people, the institutions. He plays no part in designing any of these. There's a few more that I want to add here just to round this out. So the people I've mentioned, the citizens, you can see these as the basic threads of the fabric. We have the classes and roles of these citizens: the farmers, artisans, warriors, priests. They add the texture, the generations, the young, sort of the quality, the elasticity of the threads, the old, tensile, stabilizing threads. We have principles. Like I mentioned, we have the laws, we have customs and traditions, ethos. We have logos, reason, measure. Now, these threads are interesting because we have the horizontal and the vertical. If we are to get into this, this is going to be some very rich philosophical territory. I just have to hope that we do. So, getting into the art of fulling and clothes mending, I don't think we have to really give a historical description of that. I think by now we have a sufficient understanding that we're getting farther away now again from the weaver, and we ought not to be there. He says, "Yet all of these will dispute the role of looking after the producing of clothes with the capacity which is the art of weaving, conceding a very large part to it, but assigning large shares to themselves too." And so there's an important component here. So the first thing that I think we should highlight is the role of looking after and producing clothes with the capacity which is the art of weaving. It's easy for weaving to get lost in this claim because it is something that is so fundamental to the process. But by its fundamental nature, I think it almost is given to being buried within this sort of claimant structure. There are so many things for which the fundamentals serve as the engine, the driver. And yet, what we see on the exterior is not the engine. It is concealed from us. It is protected because it's so fundamental and important. Now, there's a way in which I think I've deviated a little bit from the main point of what he's saying here. He says, "Yet all of these will dispute the role of looking after and producing clothes. The dispute will be with the art of weaving." Now, you have to wonder why. He says, conceding a very large part to it, but assigning large shares to themselves too. Now, this role of looking after and producing clothing, the weaver does this. So do others. There are plenty of people that are involved in the collective rearing of herds, which is the division that had brought us to potentially the king and the statesman. But just like all of these others, they are not involved in the interlacing. And it seems from the visitor's standpoint that this interlacing is the thing that is most philosophically rich. And that probably seems accurate. Not that some others aren't. But there seems to be a lot of potential in the weaver. Then again, the visitor says, in addition to these, we must suppose that the sorts of expertise responsible for making the tools through which the products of weaving are completed will also lay claim to being at least a contributory cause to every woven article. Now, this is an important reflection because I think it gets to the heart of something that we are dealing with now, particularly as it has to do with artificial intelligence and the engineers that produce it. I think the engineers that produce artificial intelligence and the people that utilize the artificial intelligence for what we would think of here as the weaving, or as the productive intelligence making, using it as a tool to perform the important principal action of weaving, of interlacing, of discovery. It's reasonable to assume, and it would be likely, I think, that many of the engineers would also fall within the category of being good weavers. But all the same, I'm sure that there are going to be the category of engineers who have not been weavers, or who cannot be classified as weavers, who would wish to lay claim to much like OpenAI charging for use to their platform, and of course they have to. That's sort of the model of our society. But it's this sort of payment model that you can't just buy the tool. You have to subject yourself to the tool and perpetually give it. It's not something that you can buy and own to then produce on your own, to become the weaver. You have to submit to the tool maker. And it's an interesting relationship. But necessarily you can imagine how in many cases the tool maker would want at least a part of what was created by their tool. Not every company is this way, of course, but it's clear to see. So the visitor says, so will our account of that part of the art of weaving that we selected be sufficiently definite if we proceed to set it down as finest and greatest of all these sorts of care that exist in relation to woolen clothing? Or would we be saying something true but not clear or complete until such time as we remove all of these two from around it? So we have yet to establish why it is the finest and greatest of all of those sorts of care that exist in relation to woolen clothing. And so he says we should proceed in this respect. He says, let's look at two sorts of expertise that there are in relation to all the things that people do. He says one which is a contributory cause of production, and one which is itself a cause. So today happens to be a new day, and yesterday we had just finished the end of those 2 pages. So like usual, I'm going to have to read these next 2 pages, and then we'll spend some time thinking about it and having a productive session. So the visitor says, those which do not make the thing itself, but which provide tools for those that do, tools which, if they were not present, what has been assigned to each expertise would never be accomplished. These are what I mean by contributory causes, while those that bring the thing itself to completion are causes. That seems to make sense, says young Socrates. Then as a next step, shall we call contributory causes all those that are concerned with spindles and shuttles and whatever other tools share in the process of production in relation to garments, calling those that look after and make garments themselves causes. Quite correct. Then among the causes, washing and mending, and the whole business of looking after clothes in these sorts of ways, is perfectly reasonable to encompass this part of the extensive field covered by the art of preparation by calling it all the art of the fuller. Right. Again, carding and spinning, and everything relating to the making of clothes itself, which is the thing whose parts we are talking about, all constitute a single expertise among those everybody recognizes, namely, wool-working. Of course. Next, there are two segments of wool-working, and each of these is a part of two sorts of expertise at once. How so? What has to do with carding, and half of the art of the shuttle, and all those activities that set apart from each other things that are, together? All of this we can, I suppose, declare as one and as belonging to the wool-working itself. And there were, we agreed, two great sorts of expertise in every sphere, that of combination and that of separation. Yes. Well then, it's to the art of separation that belong that of carding, and all the things just mentioned. For separation in the case of wool and warp, which happens in different ways, in the first case through the shuttle, in the second through the hands, has acquired as many names as we've referred to a moment ago. Absolutely. Then again, by contrast, let's take a part that is simultaneously a part of combination and of wool-working, and takes place in the latter. And whatever parts of separation there were here, let's let all of them go, cutting wool-working into two by means of the cutting between separation and combination. Count it as divided, says young Socrates. Then it is turn, Socrates, you should divide the part that is simultaneously combination and wool-working, if indeed we are going to capture the aforesaid art of weaving. Then I must. Indeed you must. And let's say that part of it is twisting, part intertwining. Do I understand correctly? By twisting, you seem to me to be talking about what relates to the manufacture of the warp. The visitor says, not only of the warp, but of the woof too. Are we going to find some origin for the woof which doesn't involve twisting? Certainly not. Well, define each of these two things too. Perhaps you might define them timely. Define them how? Like this. Among the products of carding, when its material is drawn out to a certain length and has required breadth, do we say that there's a flock of wool? Yes. Of this, then, the yarn that has been twisted by the spindle and has been made firm you'll call the warp, and the expertise that guides its production, warp spinning. Correct. But those threads that, in their turn, get a loose twisting and have a softness appropriate to the twining in of the warp, but also to what is needed for drawing out in the dressing process, you'll call these the products of the spinning, the woof, and the expertise that is set over their production. Let's call it woof spinning. Quite correct. And as for the part of weaving that we put forward for investigation, I suppose that's now clear to anyone. When a part of combination which is contained in wool-working produces something intertwined, by the regular intertwining of woof and warp, the whole product of the intertwining we refer to as a piece of woolen clothing, and we refer to the expertise that is over this as weaving. Quite correct. Good. So why ever, then, didn't we immediately reply that the weaving was an intertwining of whoop and warp, instead of going around in a circle defining a whole collection of things to no purpose? Young Socrates says, "To me, at least, visitor, nothing of what we have said seemed to have been said to no purpose." The visitor, "And that isn't at all surprising, I may say, but perhaps, my dear fellow, it might seem so. So against such a malady, in case it should come upon you later, that wouldn't be at all surprising. Listen to a point which it's appropriate to make in all cases like this." Okay, so it seems like we have another slight diversion coming up here. But it looks like we have an interesting couple pages to sit and to think about. Remembering that while we may not be in the deepest of philosophical territory, we're going to enter into something deep, and so we have to prepare for it. We have to draw these appropriate connections between the statesman, or the broader civilizational aspect, and the depth that we are entering into with this particular analogy. So we have to remember where we started. We're looking at two sorts of expertise that are in relation to all the things that people do. One which is a contributory cause of production, and one which is the cause itself. The visitor says, "Those which do not make the thing itself, but which provide tools for those that do, tools which, if they were not present, what has been assigned to each expertise would never be accomplished." So I think when we were thinking about breaking things down, sometimes the proximity of one thing to the principle of what we're after can cloud the vision. And here are these contributory causes, the tools that allow for something to be, or perhaps even the environment that allows for something to be, can be so closely associated to that thing that we might miss the main philosophical purpose. So if we are going to come down, for example, on what exactly it means to intertwine as a matter of expertise in both clothes making and also in the craft of statesmanship, then we have to really understand and focus on that procedure and get rid of perhaps the tools that go into the development of the strands that must be used to be intertwined. It's not a bad thing to know, surely, and perhaps even understanding the tools and how to design the tools, make the tools, to use the tools, would help us in understanding the intertwining. There's probably a two-way street when it comes to the learning of something and its execution. I know that for my own sake, for my own profession, much of it is highly conceptual, but it's impossible to perform if it is not physically embodied. Now, the explanation of it can remain a bit in the conscious domain, abstract. And I think about the associated knowledge, let's say, of physiology. And then I think about the practical, not just implicit understanding, but the understanding that is received by the participation in the act of something. So, like in this case, it would be the weaving, or in my professional life, it's interacting with people. and developing relationships, but also putting a person through a practical procedure. And through this practical procedure, I learn and they learn. We both discover what is correct. He says, while those that bring the thing itself to completion are causes. So the intertwining of these fibers to produce the cloth, to produce the stable product, are the causes. So next, the visitor calls contributory causes all those that are concerned with spindles and shuttles, and whatever other tools share in the process of production in relation to garments. So let's give a brief definition of what a spindle is and what a shuttle is. So the function of a spindle is a tool for spinning fibers into thread or yarn before weaving can happen. Loose fibers, like wool, flax, or cotton, must be twisted into continuous threads. Its form, traditionally a slender rod, sometimes with a weighted disc or a whorl attached. The spinner twists the fibers by hand, and the spindle's weight helps keep the threads taut while twisting. So the function of the shuttle is used during weaving to carry the weft, the horizontal thread, back and forth across the warp or the vertical thread. It shuttles in and out, creating an interlacing pattern that becomes cloth. Now its form is a boat-shaped tool designed to hold a bobbin or spool of thread so that the weaver can pass it smoothly across the loom. Now we save all that look after and make garments themselves causes. Now not so much the spindle, but the shuttle seems to be quite involved in that process. But it's a tool. It is a contributor. It still requires the hand to make the garments. So the cause is necessarily something that is fundamental. What I find interesting is that the cause is so intimately related to this concept of looking after. We can say attention, we can say care. I think both of these probably would work here. Look after and produce. So there's the aspect of which attention is the prerequisite to production. And production is the prerequisite to our cause in this case. What caused something to be is its production. It is its attention to something being produced. And so this is quite biblical, it would seem. This is littered throughout Genesis, this way of seeing or understanding. He says, among the causes, washing and mending, and the whole business of looking after clothes in these sorts of ways, is perfectly reasonable to encompass this part of the extensive field covered by the art of preparation, by calling it all the art of the fuller. Now, the art of the fuller, as we know, is not the same as the weaver. So let me remind myself here what the fuller exactly is. Now, it's kind of a strange question to ask because we're sort of given the definition: washing and mending, and the whole business of looking after clothes. Now, this was a specialized trade in Athens. Much like weaving or dyeing, fullers were essential because newly woven fabric was often greasy, loose, and uneven from the raw wool. It had to be treated before being used as clothing. So what did they do? They cleansed the product. They removed oils, grease, and dirt from wool and fabric. They often used alkaline substances like fuller's earth, a type of clay, soda, or even urine. Ammonia being the natural cleanser. Beating and walking, pounding, treading, or pressing cloth to mat the fibers together to make it more durable. Rinsing and stretching, washing out the cleansing agents, and stretching the cloth on frames, called tenter frames, to prevent shrinkage. So all that's to say, this is an additive. This is not the weaver, let's say. It's not the art or the expertise of the weaver. We can, I think, appreciate how, as an institution, a statesman or a king cannot manage alone. That there is a body, or there should be a body, that's around the person to distribute responsibilities and to manage. Because without this management, the error of that collective interweaving would be stagnant. It would be dirty, filled with grease. Perhaps the threads themselves would be unstable and be unable to hold. An interesting phenomena, I think, especially in the contemporary age, where I think it's clear to see that our fibers of the warp and the woof, of the horizontal and of the vertical, they are weak. The tools that have made us have been put into disuse. And I think that the quality of individuals, including myself, has eroded comparatively to other generations. Now, this is not entirely a damning statement. I think that there are plenty of things that can be built upon and probably are an innate benefit to the current generations. But I say this to say that although we may say something is a contributory cause, we have to imagine that if the fibers are not stable, if the tools that we use to produce the fibers, so necessary in the interweaving of our society, if those fibers are weak, if the institutions are weak, then so too is the product. So too is the civilization. And I find it interesting because what we see is the appeal to the weaver, the appeal to the statesman to fix the fibers, when it's not necessarily his position to do it. A wise person surely can be elected that knows how to do it. But all the same, there's a profound difficulty. There's a profound difficulty in the interweaving itself, which is our main philosophical exposition, and we really haven't even gotten there to talk about it. I'm not sure if we're going to even get there, if we take some other deviation. He says, carding and spinning, and everything related to making of clothes itself, which is the thing whose parts we're talking about, all constitute a single expertise among those everybody recognizes, namely woolworking. So I think the key insight from this section, from this paragraph, is the nestedness. Now, early in the book of Proverbs, nestedness, I think, was a very common trope. I remember what came up countless times was the image or the analogy that I would use to describe what I thought that I was seeing. This fractal representation in the form of the Russian doll, in which there is a doll that has some form that is continuous but sort of grows in size, and you nest the smaller dolls inside of the larger ones. Now, this isn't necessarily entirely what we see here, but nonetheless there is this nestedness in the sense that we are taking a broad category. What we have done, I guess, is twofold. We've taken broad categories and narrowed them down quite narrowly. We've done so to get down to the weaver. Once we have approached the weaver quite closely, we began to, and we still are, outline the boundaries around it, separating out those kinds or classes that are closely associated with it. Then once we had all of those, we sort of bundled them together and went in the opposite direction. And we gave them a broad terminology by which we can classify them, namely woolworking, as the visitor says. But he says there are two segments of woolworking, and each of these is a part of two sorts of expertise at once. Now, I should add that the weaver would also fall into the woolworking category, everything related to making of clothes itself. And we're talking about the parts of that. He says, what has to do with carding and half of the art of the shuttle? And all those activities that set apart from each other things that are together. Now here we have a philosophical sentence. What has to do with carding and half of the art of the shuttle? These are activities as he classifies as those that set apart each other, things that are together. He says half of the shuttle, because the shuttle is used sort of as a connective tool. But one part of it, I suppose, is separating the threads so that they can be moved together. That of the warp and the woof. And that of the carder, we remember, he is a bit of a cleaner, and he separates out fibers that may be stuck together. Now, when we think about it this way, these elements of expertise are quite intimately related to the fibers themselves. And yet, it is not the weaver. He says all of this we can declare as one and as belonging to woolworking itself. And he says of these two great forms of expertise, that of combination and that of separation. To the art of separation that belonged to that of carding and all things just mentioned. For separation In the case of wool and warp, wool and warp, which happens in different ways. In the first case, through the shuttle, and the second through the use of hands, as acquired as many names as we referred to a moment ago. So what can we make of this? Now it's quite easy to understand the art of separation being belonging to that of the carder. So we have a subtlety of difference in terms of separation. The stage matters. When we think about wool, we're thinking about something that is this commodity that has not been produced, has not been manufactured. It is something that's straight off of the sheep. This is something that the carder needs to clean and to thread out. In the case of the warp, this is something that has already gone through that, at least a stage of manufacture, a stage of processing. And yet, even here, it needs to be separated. It needs to be separated such that the warp can be put in between. So there's, I believe, 2 layers, the above and the below of the warp, that's separated by the shuttle. That then the warp can come through and cause this interlacing. And then he goes into, by contrast, taking a part that is simultaneously a part of combination and of wool working, and takes place in the latter. And whatever parts of separation there were here, he lets go, cutting wool working into 2 by means of the cut between separation and combination. We take somewhat of a technical or detailed step, taking out the forms of separation and keeping those of combinations. He says, let's say that part of it is twisting, part of it is intertwining. So here I want to focus on a little bit what perhaps he means by this combination. To repeat, he advises young Socrates to divide the part that is simultaneously combination and wool working. So when we think of things that are combined, we think about the woof and warp, which are 2 fibers that are born of the combination of 2 fibers of each, let's say. So that, for example, the woof is an intertwining of these 2 fibers, and the warp also an intertwining of 2 fibers. And so the visitor then is curious about defining exactly what these things are, the whoop and the warp. Among the products of carding, when its material is drawn out to a certain length and has acquired breadth, do we say that there's a flock of wool? So here, we're at a particular stage of processing the material. It is yet to be what we would consider whoop and warp. But this flock of wool is fundamental to the participation in the identity of the woof and the warp. The yarn has been twisted by a spindle and been made firm, you'll call the warp, and the expertise that guides its production warp spinning. So we have found a division, again dividing the part that is simultaneously combination and wool working. So the warp and the woof, they themselves are involved in this combination, and they are of wool working, and we have separated them out into two. He continues, those threads that in their turn get a loose twisting and have a softness appropriate to the twisting in of the warp. And so here we see a form of combination, such that in the first instance in the warp we have this twisted yarn by the spindle, and it's firm. And then in contrast we have other threads that are loosely twisted together. They have a softness appropriate to the twining in of the warp, so the interweaving of the warp. He says, but also to what is needed for drawing out in the dressing process, you call these the products of the spinning, the woof. And the expertise that is set over their production, let's call woof spinning. So I'm going to give a little bit more detailed description of this process. So the warp, these are the long vertical threads stretched taut on a loom. They are set first under tension and provide the stable framework. They are thought of as the stable order, the constitution in this sense. The woof or weft, these are the softer horizontal threads woven in and out through the warp. They bring color, variety, and texture. They also bind the whole together. So in terms of spinning the woof, the loose twisting, unlike the warp, which must be tightly spun so it doesn't snap under tension, the woof can be softer and looser. The softness allows the weft to bend easily through the warp. It doesn't need tensile strength, it needs pliability. Now the dressing process that the visitor mentions, or dressing the loom, refers to preparing it, setting the warp in place and making sure that the threads can accept the woof. So the woof spinning produces softer, more yielding threads that will later be shuttled through the warp. So let's spend some time thinking about a philosophical equivalent to this warp and weft. Now, whether or not we progress into this territory, I have to imagine that we would, but even if we don't, I think it's going to be a good exercise in terms of defining the statesman. So this warp and weft situation, we have these really strong tensile fibers of the warp. And so I have to ask myself, what about our society is made up of these strong tensile fibers? In the body, these strong tensile fibers, they're often formed of collagen. It is something of similar, actually, to this analogy. Muscle spindles are actually a joint receptor that sends us information from our muscle tissue. But much like this tissue that transfers load from one structure to the next, such that the structure, the more stable components can be movable, at least in the case of the body, but also it provides, outside of cases of tendons when we consider ligaments, these stabilize major surfaces, bone-to-bone surfaces. When we think about other tissues such as cartilage, we find collagen there as that strong tensile strength, but also as something that supports between joint surfaces. It protects joint surfaces. And so by this, when we think of transferring load, transferring stresses, absorbing impact, facilitating motion, my mind keeps going to the idea of institutions. And not just any institution, because I think the term institution can be a broad net, so to speak. And if we think philosophically, boiling institutions down based on the importance by their function, I think, is important. So if we think on a broad scale, educational institutions are important. Our governing institutions are important. Those that uphold law or have a judicial function. The institutions that surround health and well-being, our religious institutions, are important. Not all of these, of course, are state apparatuses, as they should not be, but the institutions provide stability in the sense that they give us order. They give us something to depend on. And among all of them, I think sometimes it can be difficult to find that exact commonality or that principled parallel. But among education, of learning of any type, of learning a skill, of learning a practical skill, this is something that people take on themselves. They sacrifice a part of themselves and their time because they think it is valuable. And the skill they can use to offer it to others. And this skill that is offered it's pliable, especially in our society. It is something of a weft type of structure. It can be interwoven. It could integrate in many different facets. Some people use their skills for tremendous purposes, other for quite mundane purposes. Some for good, some for bad. But the point being that the institution provides some tensile strength to the society. My mind wanders to geography a little bit here. I sort of wonder exactly what is there. I think as far as prudence is concerned, when we consider geography and the founding of cities and the establishment of agriculture, surely geography matters. And where we establish ourselves does have an impact. And so when we consider a statesman that is looking over this apparatus that's perhaps has some responsibility to the land that is associated with a particular state identity, it is not something that ought not to be considered. It's something that should be considered. And in matters of understanding climate, again, understanding the utility, but also perhaps preservation and the quality of life that a landscape can provide the people who live on it. These are all things that can be considered and managed to a degree, directed, harmonized. We don't want a society that devolves into a hellish industrial landscape, but we also don't want a society that is void of industry and manufacture. And so, as far as leadership is concerned, and that harmonizing of the instruments, the harmonizing of the fibers, what I would wish, I suppose, is to have a healthy balance between the two, or a harmony between the two, an interlacing, such that one isn't sacrificed in the face of the other. Now, when I think about my own participation in society, I find myself, actually, I thought something to this effect when I was driving home today from work, that just from a personal standpoint, a personal matter, I think there's a lot that I need to do to work on being more involved in my society, being less introverted and less self-absorbed. And that selfishness, I think, is such a principle. It's such a root of unfortunate secondary consequences, relationally, but also just experientially, on the part of the individual, but also on the part of those who participate with the selfish individual. And I say this because I'm thinking about my experience in this thing that I call the society, the civilization in Western civilization. Much of what I am, what I've come to be, I think has been formed under convention by many different interactions among things, the environment, the people, the institutions. And it all at once doesn't sort of dawn on me as being something I can immediately draw to my mind, but as I think about it, as the memories filter through my mind, I think I can begin to understand my place here. And as I go searching for the tensile strength of my experience or participation with this culture, I depend on others. I depend on knowledge of others. I think about where I'm sitting right now, in this chair, in a building, in a room that is 4 stories up. There's a lot that goes into affording and experiencing the life in the way that I do. I think there are plenty of things that can be done in terms of reflection to think about the way in which we do them and if they can be improved on or not, but all the same, just thinking about the basics in terms of the things that I possess that afford me something, that provide value. The chair, the computer, the microphone, the book, the room, the air conditioning. All of this is something that, all of these things I know very little about. It's not as though I can wake up tomorrow and produce something like this. And for my part, my experience in it, my role in it, the skills that I do have, they are a small part in this broader thing. And these threads, I think, begin to appear a bit more spiritually. The threads of warp, that is. Because on one hand, yes, they are institutional, but they're not limited to that. The tensile strength, as I've mentioned, and I don't want to get caught up in, I'm concerned with the singular at this time, the singular thread of warp. I understand that in combination, all of these things together just improve that. Now, understanding that the warp itself has constituent elements, and understanding that by this mode, as the visitor said, of separation and combination, I think we can reflect even farther into the weeds, so to speak, in the sense of separation of the singular fiber, of separation of the individual fibers, or in view of combination, of a fiber with its constituent elements and the fibers as they relate to each other in terms of the warp, the overall tensile strength that it has, and then in terms of the integrated woof or woof that is integrated within it. I think about the roads, I think about infrastructure, how important that is to a society, and how a strong infrastructure is quite a pulse on the state of a society, of a national identity. And of course the ways in which the individual components interact on that sphere, how courteous perhaps they are, or how willing they are to follow the traffic laws. For infrastructure and its material facilitation that it provides us and the law are two separate things. One is sort of immaterial, the other is material. And the two cross at a certain point. We can get pulled over on a road and we can get into an accident on a road. And yet, I think that both of these are aspects that provide a society with tensile strength. And the degree to which they are functional, I think, is the degree to which, in the fabric sense, it is a practical garment that is strong and resistant to tear. Okay, so today happens to be a new day. A new day brings new thoughts. I don't want to continue this episode much longer because we're approaching the 2-hour mark. Now, I believe last time what I was the object of last session was to experiment with the different ways we can associate the woof and the warp to our society. Now, I believe I went through the warp, but not the woof. But I'm thinking now that I may save it for next episode. But I would like to finish this off and make sure that there's no loose ends on this last bit of dialogue on the page. So I'm going to read. The visitor says, "And as for the part of weaving that we put forward for investigation, I suppose that's now clear to anyone. When the part of combination which is contained in wool working produces something intertwined, by the regular intertwining of woof and warp, the whole product of the intertwining we refer to as a piece of woolen clothing, and we refer to the expertise that is over this as weaving." And then he goes into the question, well, why didn't we immediately get to this place, to the definition? Why did it take such a long, winding road to get there? Young Socrates says something that I think is true. He says that although the path has been winding and our result may be fairly simple, it wasn't all for naught. It had some purpose. So with this, I'm going to end this episode and continue next time with our next 2 pages.